Hi, this is my dad's homemade table saw. He built this as a second table saw to go along with his Felder table saw, and he built it partially using parts from his Felder table saw that needed to be replaced because they weren't made very well. So he reused the sliding table from the Felder, which has got a little bit of play in it, which is why it had to be replaced, and also the arbor mounted bearings from the Felder needed to be replaced, and he reused that part for this particular saw. So let's have a closer look inside this saw. So this is the bearing block and arbor from the Felder that needed to be replaced, and my dad made an arbor mount out of welded together pieces of plate steel and angle iron. It's powered with a flat belt right here, which actually my dad used an old timing belt, and that goes down to a big 3 horsepower motor, and that motor has actually got a wooden pulley on it, and that's how this saw is powered. The arbor is completely fixed in place. It doesn't tilt or move up and down, so the only way you can adjust the depth of cut is to tilt the whole table, although that's a very awkward sort of thing. And with the table level, this table saw has 1100 millimeter depth of cut. That's about 4 3/8 of an inch, so quite deep. But the problem is you can't easily lower the blade, so it's always cutting that deep unless you tilt the table. So the only way you could make a less than full depth of cut on this saw is to put some spacer blocks in here, and then the table will be tilted, at which point you can't actually use it with a crosscut sled. So it's not something that my dad ever used, but it does have a facility for doing a less than full depth of cut. The motor is this really big farm duty motor, and it has a really strong starting torque, so the belt always ends up slipping a little bit while it starts. And to keep the belt from coming off, there's a block of wood here, and there's another piece up here, and between those two, that keeps the belt from slipping off when it's starting. Once it's running, the nature of the crown pulley helps keep the belt on. There's a simple sort of tracking adjustment, so the motor is mounted on this plank here, and then these 2 bolts here and here allow this plank to be moved side to side so that the pulley angle changes a little bit so that the tracking can be adjusted. Now, flat belts need an awful lot of tension to operate properly, so there's a bolt here for tightening it, and that connects up to a piece of angle iron attached to the board that the motor is mounted on, so when that bolt is tightened, that pulls the motor away from the saw blade, which tightens the pulley. The whole saw can be moved on wooden wheels, and this mechanism here is a sort of a wheel lock, so if I tighten this bolt, that forces this piece against the wheel and prevents it from turning, and so it locks the wheels. The rib fence, of course, is also homemade, but because it needs a fair bit of edge here to clamp to, you can really only move out about 13 inches or 33 centimeters from the blade. So this saw isn't really useful for ripping up sheet goods, but my dad never really worked with sheet goods very much, so this saw was intended for cutting up rough lumber. And this is actually a lot wider than any sort of boards that he would get from the sawmill, so it's far enough. With the sliding table on this saw coming from the Felder, it accepts all the peripherals that clamp onto here from the Felder. So I'm just going to put the table extension on here, which is a quick cutter system that Felder has got for their saws. So now I've got my table extended, and now I'm going to put homemade crosscut fence on here. So this fence is not adjustable, but the nice thing is it's always 90 degrees and you can count on that. And now to cut a piece of wood on this saw. I do have to admit this saw has always intimidated me a little bit. It is a bit of a monster of a saw, but let me show you how it runs.